This is a review of the 1978 Hall Bartlett film, The Children of Sanchez, which stars Anthony Quinn. This movie came onto my radar because I had long been aware of the song and the soundtrack album, Children of Sanchez by Chuck Mangione. This is probably Chuck Mangione's second most famous song, and I think it's a fairly well-known song, but I live in outer space, so I'm not very good at estimating what is popular and what is not out in the real world. Either way, I listened to the song quite a bit. Cool song, cool album, and I was vaguely aware that it was written for a movie, but it never occurred to me that it would be the soundtrack for a good movie. I don't know why exactly, but it just never struck me as seeming like it would be part of a good movie, partly because it's kind of cheesy, has some lyrics that sort of make sense, and because when you hear Children of Sanchez, I think you think of sort of an adventure kind of thing. This is a movie from the 70s. You think of sort of low-budget adventure film from the 70s, and it does not make you feel super confident, or you're not looking forward to watching that movie necessarily. But these days, I find myself in a strange place where I'm watching more and more movies that I don't seem like they'd be that great for various reasons that sort of make sense. And so I figured, hey, why not watch The Children of Sanchez? And I can confirm that this movie is not very good. If it were a bit better, it would be really good. And I'll explain what I mean by that. But there is some, as usual, interesting stuff about the movie. First of all, it's got Anthony Quinn in it. Anthony Quinn, very interesting actor. I think if you'd asked me when I was first starting to watch movies where Anthony Quinn was from, I would have said England. I would have thought he was British or something just because of the sort of movies that he was in. But he actually was born in Mexico, and he's Mexican-American and was sort of a prominent Latin American figure during his career. And that's part of the reason why the president, Jimmy Carter, attended the premiere of The Children of Sanchez in 1978, was because Anthony Quinn was sort of well-known as an activist for Latin American issues and rights and respect and whatnot. The Anthony Quinn's career is kind of interesting because he was a foreigner. He was mostly employed to play other foreigners, not necessarily Mexicans, but really people from anywhere. So, for instance, he plays Omar Mukhtar in Lion of the Desert, which is a great movie, but sort of interesting casting. Famously, probably his most famous role is playing Zorba in the movie Zorba the Greek, right? Not Greek, but back in the day, I guess Hollywood thought, okay, well, you're not white, you can be anyone who's not white. That's sort of kind of a weird career arc that was a lot of what defined his career. But in this movie, he plays a Mexican, and the whole movie is set in Mexico, and stars, all the characters are Mexican, and most of the actors are, if not Mexican, they're from Latin America somewhere. I think the actress who plays Consuelo is from Venezuela, maybe. Lupita Ferrer is her name. She was married to the director, Hall Bartlett, who's also a sort of an interesting character. Hall Bartlett directed the movie Unchained, which has an interesting legacy in the song Unchained Melody, which was originally written for that movie but was later covered by the Righteous Brothers, which is an extremely famous, although here we go again, I think it's an extremely famous song. He also wrote the movie 0 Hour, which is kind of interesting. 0 Hour is the movie that Airplane is a takeoff on. Not many people realize that Airplane is almost a shot-for-shot takeoff, in parts of it at least, like the sort of final coming in for a landing bit, is copied almost shot-for-shot, as a satire, of course, from this movie 0 Hour that Hall Bartlett wrote. The Zucker brothers did this for other things as well, like Police Squad had some sort of a shot-for-shot remake of another television show. But we're getting a bit far afield here. We're talking about The Children of Sanchez. Here's another really interesting thing about this movie is that the screenplay was co-written by Hall Bartlett and Cesare Zavattini. You may or may not know who that is, but he was a huge figure in the Italian neorealism movement. And in fact, when I was in college studying film studies, at least partly. In one class, can't remember which, we read an essay written by none other than Cesare Zavattini, in which he talked about how the common traditional forms of narrative in classic American movies were basically capitalists. Zavattini, I guess, was a Marxist and was looking for radically new ways to tell stories of disenfranchised people, the people who really matter, in the world. So already, we start to see that maybe my initial impressions about this being sort of a bland adventure movie from the 70s aren't quite right. We've got Anthony Quinn, finally, making a movie about Mexico. We've got Cesare Zavattini, right, who has a strong ideological background. And this movie, both of those things, I think, are carried across in this movie, in the sense that, in some ways, this movie seems fairly authentic, although we'll get into that in a moment. But with Zavattini, this movie has a strong ideological position, and that's pretty cool. This is one of the reasons why I said that if this movie were a bit better, it could be really good. In general, it's an ambitious movie. Not only does it have sort of a central ideological underpinnings, which I will specify shortly, but it also has a big story, a lot of characters in a lot of places over a lot of time. And if the pieces had all come together, I think it would have been a pretty epic movie with pretty strong perspective that tells a powerful story. But it doesn't come together. And why is that? Well, instead of being a big story about all these different people, it's kind of a confusing story. You really get the sense that this movie was edited down a lot. You get the sense that maybe even there are scenes missing from it. There are things that happen that are just sort of unclear. It is honestly kind of hard to follow. Partly maybe this is because the print of the movie that I found to watch was terrible, and it was sort of difficult to hear at times and difficult to tell actors apart at times, especially. There's a number of fairly dark scenes in the movie. There's a couple of crucial events that happen in very dark scenes that were a bit difficult to discern for me. And like I said, a sprawling movie with a ton of characters that seems like some big pieces were edited out. So I think it's important to be a focused viewer and to pay attention to movies, but I'm by no means a person who's making spreadsheets and rewinding to figure out what everything is going on. If the movie's not making sense as you're watching it, well, it probably is not that great of a movie if you're really paying attention and giving it your all. And this movie really suffers from that. There's a couple of places where they tried to fix things. For instance, in the beginning, they have little subtitles, sort of, that lower third sort of things that identify who each character is. You get the feeling that they were aware that it was a bit hard to follow and it was a bit hard to tell who was who and how everyone is related to each other. Big families where people may or may not be kids and they may be just lovers, they may be children, all kinds of crossover, hard to keep it straight. And like I said, they were probably aware of this because they added little lower thirds to introduce the characters at the beginning. Unfortunately, that doesn't really help that much. So, like I said, in the end, this movie doesn't exactly come together, but it still has some virtues. So let me be more specific about the ideological position of this movie. This movie is an adaptation of a book called The Children of Sanchez, and it's a book that was written by an American, I think, a white anthropologist, I guess, or sociologist, or something along those lines, who was who was formulating this idea of something that he referred to, I forget this guy's name, but he referred to it as the culture of poverty, which is... It's an interesting idea. I mean, I think these days it's sort of maybe more widely understood that perhaps living in poverty ingrains some sort of internalized, there's some sort of internalized stamp of poverty that being poor puts on people and whatnot. And this is kind of an iffy idea in some ways, and I'll tell you how you touch on this. It's kind of an iffy idea to put in a movie in some ways, because you're towing the line between showing characters who seem not very positive characters, and you could watch this movie and think, hold on, this movie is stereotyping poor people as being mean, brutish, not very smart, selfish, and whatnot. Or you could watch this movie and walk away and think, here's a story about internalized poverty, which is what you're supposed to think about the movie. But it does teeter a little bit. This is regardless of whether or not you think the actual idea is right. But like I said, it sort of borders on maybe a sort of very regressive stereotypes about the poor. I think the main virtue of this movie is that it is unflinching, right? So Anthony Quinn's character in this movie is not a likable character, basically. He's sort of a bit of an abusive father, a man with his own sort of cruel habits and his own immense insecurities, problems, and whatnot, who is mostly unable to act as a father figure to his family, to love his family, and whatnot. And like I said, you could look at this and say, that's really a pretty dim view of poor people. Or you could look at it and take sort of the neorealist approach to things. But it does teeter. It does teeter a little bit. But suffice to say, this is not a movie. This is not sort of a romanticization of poverty, without a doubt. There are definitely moments of sort of humanity and whatnot. There are moments of wisdom, moments of love, touching moments within the family. But for the most part, those are few and far between, and the family is actually at odds, tearing itself apart for most of the time. And most of the sort of nuggets of wisdom that are imparted, some by the grandmother or by the elderly, are not, I think, meant to be taken at face value as the wisdom of the poor, but instead are, well, so for instance, the grandmother tells Consuelo, who's the daughter of Sanchez, tells her that women are not going to be free anytime soon, and the best thing that can happen to a woman is for her to fall in love, but not to expect any sort of freedom or anything like that. Which, like I said, that's put in a place where sort of the maternal wisdom should go. The way the quote is set up, the way the sort of grandmother talks about it, gives advice and things. But I don't think it's Zavattini or Bartlett's idea that. I don't think that is their thesis necessarily. Rather, it's an unflinching look at what sort of ideology might develop in these conditions. Similarly, Jesus Sanchez, that's Anthony Quinn's character, at one point says, the only way to not get kicked in the ass continuously is to accept your place in life, right? So that's internalized poverty in a nutshell. And if you know the song, Children of Sanchez, and you've listened to the lyrics of it at all, without dreams, a man will die, or something along those lines. The song very clearly lays out the ideology of the movie, and frankly, you might as well just listen to the song and not bother with the movie. A note about the soundtrack is that while the music is pretty cool on its own, I think it actually doesn't fit the movie at all. Mostly they lean on the title track, Children of Sanchez, which is kind of interesting because that soundtrack album also includes, I think Consuelo's love theme is like 17 minutes long, which is kind of funny. And it's not even clear if any of that is really in the movie. Although, again, the sound in my copy was very bad, and it was hard to tell exactly which part of the song we were at. There's a couple of snippets of the music that are used pretty effectively, but for the most part, it seems pretty out of place. And in fact, I didn't realize this when I was listening to the music, but because this movie has this sort of is set in Mexico, the Chuck Mangione sort of attempts some sort of Latin themes at times, which don't really seem right at all, and are So, like I said, the music doesn't really seem to fit the movie very well, but I would recommend the soundtrack otherwise, just on its own. And like I said, I would recommend that above the movie. A couple other interesting things about the movie. I mentioned that the beginning has some intertitles, or has some like subtitles to show which character is which. The beginning in general of this movie is a total mess. It jumps around in time a whole bunch. It has some voiceover narration, but it also has these titles. Clearly, they were having trouble getting people to understand what the heck was going on. They had to add these elements and whatnot. But it's part of the reason it's confusing is because it starts sort of back in time and then flashes forward 15 years or something like that. And like I said, the movie takes place in a bunch of different locations, Mexico City, I think, and Monterrey, and all over the place. Kind of hard to tell what exactly is going on at times. But one of the things that is interesting that's set up at the beginning is the generational, the idea, a feeling of generational change and a conflict of tradition. You start out in sort of a very sort of traditional Mexican setting, and it seems like the movie is set like quite a ways in the past or something. It seems like the movie's going to take place out in rural Mexico a long time ago or something like that. And then after the intro, you cut to Consuelo riding on a bus, like in a city, and her brother watching a highlight match, which I don't think I could have named another movie that features a highlight match in it, but this one does, briefly. And there's this interesting sort of effect there where it's the jarring jump into the present and whatnot, and I actually think that's a bit of a strength in the movie. They also carry this even further as they show Consuelo studying to be an airline stewardess and whatnot, which is kind of the total other, is kind of the opposite end of the spectrum from the sort of traditional one-room farm experience that you're sort of set up with. In some ways, also worth noting that if you have seen the movie Roma, Cuarón's version, he uses this idea of the airplane flying overhead as the specter of modernity and whatnot. I think it's at the beginning of the movie, you see the airplane flying overhead reflected in a puddle on the ground. Wow, what a great imagery, talking about how, the specter of modernity with the airplane sort of out of place in the traditional town and whatnot. Okay, well, he ain't the first to think about the airplane like that. This movie does it too, and I'm sure many others do, but that's okay. So, in general, The Children of Sanchez, like I said, not that great. Really, I would file this movie under telenovela. Like I said, big family, lots of kids, not clear if they're actually kids or not. Lots of drama. Now, like I said, it does have an ideological, a central ideological thrust. It is, at times, remarkably unflinching. There's some quite raw scenes, and a couple of scenes that are approaching being powerful. But in general, the movie is just a bit too hard to follow and doesn't really come together into a cohesive whole. But if they had gotten this right, I think it could have been a pretty cool movie. And maybe they would have needed the parts that seem clearly to have been left on the cutting room floor. So in general, I wouldn't recommend The Children of Sanchez, but you can listen to the Chuck Mangione song or the soundtrack album, Children of Sanchez, if you are curious.